I was very struck by Gabriel Palma's introduction on choice and options. He said inequality is a choice. And I want to say yes and no. And that's because, as a political scientist, there are spaces for choice and incentives for choice and disincentives for choice. And those spaces, it's what I've called previously the structure of choice. And those spaces can be very wide and open, or they can be very narrow. In my own work on mineral and oil exporting countries, I called this the paradox of plenty because those countries that were very wealthy in mineral and oil endowments actually had a very narrow structure of choice. So they look like they have lots of options because they have lots of rents, and in fact, they have very narrow options. So I tried with other political scientists to build different kinds of structures of choice based on the leading sectors of an economy, in part, not only on that, but in part on the leading sectors of an economy. This is not a new idea. I learned a lot of this from Albert Hirschman, but Adam Smith said a long time ago that the Tartars and the Spanish had two different notions of wealth. The Tartars thought that wealth was sheep, and then if you didn't have any sheep, you lacked pecos, and you were pecuniary. That means lack of sheep. You were poor. The Spanish thought if you had gold and silver, you were rich. And he said of the two, the Tartars were correct. So this is not a new notion of mine, but I think it's really important to understand that the choice of inequality there may be more possibilities in some areas for choice than there are in others. And this is what I call the structure of choice. In countries that are dependent on a leading export, the range of choice gets narrower and narrower, especially if it is minerals, and most especially if it is oil, and because of the dependence on a single export. And I think that that choice and range of choice actually declines over time. I've traced that in a book called The Paradox of Plenty, and I won't say more about that. But what is important in that decline over time and the dependence on certain rent-based sectors, be they minerals or other forms of finding rents, is that the nature of the economy also changes over time, from a neoclassical understanding of the economy to what I would call an exploitation-based economy. And that is an economy that over time, the role of rents plays a greater and greater role rather than a lesser and lesser role. And those rents, exploitation economy, those rents are very much linked to the political system and to the ability of economic or political actors to capture rents because they are able to capture the state or parts of the state or a piece of the state or an agency of the state or a friend in the state or whatever. And that means that these exploitation economies over time act very differently in dealing with the problem of inequality than economies that have less of that factor. That's the first point I want to make. And that means that when you try to understand the difference between Slovenia on the one hand and South Africa, part of that explanation has to do with their leading sectors historically, and the space, the structure of choice that creates in both of those different polities, and the role that rents play differentially in those different economies. There's a second point I want to make about that. This is a deteriorating situation, or it can be, a deteriorating situation over time. And that means the issue of thresholds is extremely important in looking at the kinds of data the rich data that was given to us this morning. So it matters, for example, I'll give you an example on the work I know the best. If your economy has more than 25% of GDP as coming from rents from minerals or petroleum, you are much more likely, you are highly probable to be unequal, and those inequalities will grow. So there's a threshold effect. If you're under 20 to 25% of minerals or oil, you are more likely to reduce inequalities over time. Now, I could do that for other types of sectors as well, but the most important thing I want to put out is, first of all, there's a structure of choice, number one, and number two, that the thresholds matter. The degree to which an economy is more and more turned into what I call an exploitation economy. It's a term, by the way, that Joe Stiglitz is using now as well. If you are turning into an exploitation or a more and more increasingly rent-based economy where the capture of rents depends on the relationship with the polity, you are more, and it becomes more and more difficult in the structure of choice to change inequality. The next point I want to make in this is that it's about point of departure. And by that I mean we go back often, we look at the colonial period, we see what the structure of land was, we see how that changed over time or didn't change over time, et cetera. And while I don't want to talk about the point of departure very much, since we're really looking at snapshots much more of today, I do want to say that point of departure does matter. It is important, although it's not nearly as important as I personally once thought it was. It means that, for example, and let me again give an example from my own work, when you compare Norway and Venezuela and oil, and both of them are highly dependent on petroleum revenues now, the difference between them is astonishing. When I was in Norway and they were having a conference between 3 generations about how they should distribute generationally across generations, genders, and the polity, the rents from petroleum, I sat there with my mouth open because I've been in, Nigeria, Venezuela, Iran, I'm like going, what are you talking about? Nobody in oil exporting countries that I go to talks about saving for a future generation. It just doesn't even happen. So when you look at that story, the reason for that story had to do with the late entry of petroleum as a major factor in the economy, which meant that the civil service was already set up, the polity was already set up, one of the oldest civil services in the world. It's not that Norwegians are not corrupt, even though they don't have an oil corruption problem, and they're one of the only places in the world that doesn't, right? But it's that the civil service and the laws and rules and controls were set up prior to that. So when they had to figure out in their sequencing of how they were going to deal with, say, oil revenues, and how were they going to deal with a platform in the sea, they made it a ship. They said a platform is a ship, and we're shipbuilders, and we've had strong labor protections for people who build ships, and we regulate ships in the following way, and we tax ships in the following way. And so they just took that whole structure and put it on top of a newer form of development. That's what I mean about point of departure mattering. And I think one of the key questions in inequality, and it's certainly one of the key questions for those of us who study democracy, is if the point of departure is not favorable, can you change it? And if so, how do you change it? And that's a very, I think, a key question. Let me go to the next point I want to make, which is the difference between virtuous and vicious cycles of inequality. I study vicious cycles, unfortunately, but of course you have to know something about virtuous cycles to know how vicious cycles get so vicious. And without getting into the question of what is the chicken and what is the egg here, let me hold that. Here's what I know and what I believe we found also in Philippe Schmitter and my study of 121 countries on inequality, which is economic inequality generates political inequalities. It generates changes in the legal system, changes in the political system, changes in the administrative system that then further economic inequalities and privilege the rich over the poor inside the political system. Now, whether it's the polity that generates the original inequalities or the economy that generates the original political inequalities is not the question. The fact is that this is a vicious cycle, that those political inequalities then generate policies of unfairness that are built in and reinforced inside the polity itself. Now, this is not a stable process because, once again, thresholds come in. So you can get into a vicious cycle of inequality, which we are in the United States right now. You can get into a vicious cycle. And that vicious cycle, if not stopped, if not changed, will reach a threshold which will begin to cause instability in the rules of the polity. That's part of what we're seeing in the United States right now. The instability of the rules doesn't mean you're going to have a coup or anything. It just means the rules are changing and nobody knows where they're going, number one. But if that continues, and I'm not talking about the United States right now, but if you get to a threshold when you have instability of rules, you may eventually get into issues of regime change, the dramatic collapse of political parties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is related very much to the threshold of inequalities and the degree of inequalities that we saw this morning. Okay. That means that you get into a situation of a vicious cycle in which exploitation economies grow, rents grow, the relationship with the polity becomes more and more important as a way of capturing rents. As that becomes more and more clear, the notion of unfairness becomes clearer and clearer, and that begins to change in ways that may reinforce inequalities or challenge inequalities, the rules of the game. The virtuous cycle, I don't have to explain, it's the exact opposite, right? And the question is, how do you get coalitions of fairness or coalitions of unfairness, which are the same? I mean, which are obviously very different, but which have very strong implications for the production of what we saw this morning, and the resolution of what we saw this morning. Let me then go along with that analysis a little more. There are extremely strong resistances to change in both the economy and the polity. And one of the things that we know about inequality is that when it changes pretty dramatically. But it is quite easy to change inequalities pretty quickly. It is not so easy to revert back to an older pattern or to reduce or change back to another pattern. So the strong resistances to change are something that we need to think about. One of those is very clear, which is that capital is globalized, but polities are national. So if I start to change inequalities, capital can leave, but the polity is national. That's a huge problem for the reduction of inequalities. If you start taxing capital in a certain way, and that capital is globalized, it may go find somewhere else to park, the Bahamas, wherever. And that's one issue. A second issue is, and this is something that Philippe and I have both worked on, and that has to do with regime type. We once thought, I think ideologically more than anything else, we meaning political scientists a long time ago, and many economists, that democracy, by its very nature, since one citizen, one vote, would reduce inequalities. Well, it turns out that's just not true. And that there's a huge range of inequalities in democracy, both democracies that reduce and democracies that increase. There is also a huge range in authoritarian regimes. Authoritarian regimes that increase, Pinochet, right? And authoritarian regimes that actually reduce, which has been one of the very interesting features of the Iranian Revolution and other ones that I can talk about. So there is a range over time, and regime type matters, again, not as much as we thought, and with much greater variation than we thought. And finally, I want to say something about just democracies. When you try to understand democracies, when I try to understand what's happening in my own country right now, one of the things that is very clear is that the poor over and over and over again vote against what is considered their class interests. We know this. You can call it false consciousness, call it whatever you want. There's lots of research to explain this now. And that research is also very, very much linked to the issue of thresholds. If you are starting to increase inequalities and people look around them and see that in their region somebody's getting very rich, they will vote for the increase of inequalities over and over and over. We see it over and over and over because some of what they see next door to them may come down to them. That's the original hope. But when you cross a threshold where the inequalities are so great and the opportunities to advance are so limited, which is the United States today, by the way. We have the least mobility of any advanced industrialized country and the greatest level of inequality. We have crossed a threshold. The way people begin to vote changes. It changes because they see that what their neighbor has is something they are never going to be able to get. And so they begin to go to protest parties, whether they be protest parties of the left or the right. And in general, these tend to be populist parties of the left and the right. And finally, let me say something about policies. We know a ton about inequality. We know how much inequality there is in different places. We see it increase. There's a general understanding how bad it is in many places. And so the question becomes what I ask my graduate students when they come in and say they want to do a dissertation. I say, so what? Tell me, answer so what? Why do you want to work on that? Why is it important? Because if we know so much, why are we unable to change what we're seeing in some very important ways? And I would say that some of that has to do with this issue of class voting, where you vote the way the rich go up to a certain threshold and then you start to protest. But some of it has to do with the fact that the causes of inequality that are visible are much easier to challenge than the ones that are invisible. Let me give you an example from my own country. The policies, let's take two policies. One is that in 2003, the United States government, which is the largest buyer of pharmaceuticals in the world, passed a law that the United States government, is not going to regulate the price of pharmaceuticals and is also it gave a whole set of privileges to the pharmaceutical industry. At the same time, we have a law that says student debt can never be forgiven. Never. You have student debt till you die, and then it goes to your kids, right? So it can never be forgiven. Those are policies. They have tremendous consequences for inequality. So the issue is, why are policies so bad? Well, if you look at elections over and over again, whether it's Latin America, Africa, or anywhere else, it is much easier to blame a visible potential cause of inequality, immigrants, which is not the major cause of inequality in the United States by far, not even close, or trade agreements, because jobs are going overseas. Again, not the major cause of inequality by far, but what nobody talks about is the financialization of the economy and the rents that accrue from the financial sector of the economy, which is the leading driver of inequality in the United States and in many other countries. So that is not talked about, whereas the campaigns focus on the visible. So I want to put all of that out there for the resistance to change, and then end with the following, which is when inequality changes, patterns of inequality change, they almost always change from huge crisis. Now that crisis can be a coup, it can be regime change, it can be the collapse of the economy, it can be a revolution, it can be many things, but there is a dramatic moment, whether it is a very deep recession that terrifies somebody, there's a dramatic moment that is the catalyst for change, because the resistance that I talked about in the periods of normal politics is very, very strong. Thank you.